My name is Ronnie Witherup, and I have the pleasure of being the president of the Belfast Charitable Society. I want to welcome all of you to this official launch of the McCracken Foundation and the lecture on the legacies of slavery by Professor David Olusoga. Now, I understand there's a very wide audience tonight. Some of you will be familiar with our presentation. Some of you will be new. If you'll forgive me, I'll just say a few words about the Belfast Charitable Society before I introduce our speaker for this evening. We have just completed the 249th Annual General Meeting of the Belfast Charitable Society earlier this evening. And as that figure would suggest, we are a very old charity. Belfast Charitable Society is the oldest charity in Northern Ireland. It was founded in 1752, and they built a magnificent Clifton House in Belfast, which opened in 1774. If you're able to and have never visited that building, and times permit, I recommend that you do so. It's a treasure house, as well as being, as I've described it, a magnificent building. But you recognize from the date that it opened, it precedes the abolition of slavery. McCracken, whose foundation we're launching this evening, was born in 1770. And she and her family were much involved with the Belfast Charitable Society. Mary Ann was on the Ladies' Committee. She was interested in the welfare of poor women and children who were accommodated in Clifton House in those early days. And she was interested in the education of the children and the apprenticeships being provided. In time, she was concerned with famine relief during the Great Famine in Ireland. And amongst her many activities, she was in the League Against Slavery and actively involved in proceedings in Belfast in relation to that. Now, the Belfast Charitable Society has recently ceased to make direct provision for adult care in Clifton House, and it's redirected its efforts to general support for the disadvantaged. And in seeking to do that, we've taken Mary Ann McCracken as our inspiration and model and created the Mary Ann McCracken Foundation. She lived in turbulent times at the end of the 18th and the first half of the 19th century. It was a period of revolution. Her brother was Henry Joy McCracken. He was commander of the Northern Army during the 1798 rebellion. Mary Ann McCracken attended his execution in Belfast after the rebellion. She committed herself to a multitude of good causes. She was a remarkable woman and led a fascinating life. One of the earliest actions of the foundation was to republish her biography, which was first published in 1960. And it's now available, published through the Irish Academic Press. And if you haven't got a copy, I recommend it. We've also produced a walking map of Belfast showing sites that Mary Ann would have been familiar with, or what now stands in their place in Belfast. And it is a very interesting and useful guide. Now, we in the Charitable Society have not shied away from the fact that in the 18th and 19th century, some members of this society benefited from the slave trade. And some members of the society were part of the abolitionist movement. And this match must have been evident in many societies. It was evident in this society. And we share this information in our talks and tours. And we try to encourage those who are involved to think about how some of those who were dedicated to helping the poor in Belfast were clearly less charitable to suffering that occurred elsewhere. Well, Mary Ann McCracken was clearly on the abolitionist side at that time. And so we thought it would be fitting that we seek to join her legacy with the legacy of slavery, as articulated by no less a distinguished figure than Professor David Olusoga. Professor Olusoga is Professor of Public History at Manchester University. He's also an award-winning TV and film presenter and author of books and articles, and they include the subjects of the slave trade and indeed military matters. And most recently, he's been in the public eye in his interview with former President Barack Obama. So I suppose that it is fitting that today is the inauguration of the 46th President, Joe Biden, earlier on this afternoon. So it's with great pleasure that I invite Professor Olusoga to launch the Mary Ann McCracken Foundation by delivering his talk on the legacies of slavery. So Professor Olusoga, it's over to you.
So Ronnie, thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you to the Society for inviting me to speak. I wish, of course, that I could be with you in person, and I realize how greatly your plans and your timetables, like those of thousands of organizations and institutions and charities, have been disrupted by the historic events that we're currently living through. So it would be better to be together, but it's good to be with you virtually. And I resent the loss of a potential trip to Belfast next time. We meet virtually in the aftermath of a remarkable year, and 2021, just 20 days old, appears to be heading on a similar trajectory as its predecessors. Despite the enormity of the global pandemic for millions of people, last year, 2020, will be remembered above all for the Black Lives Matter protests after the murder of George Floyd. And one of the questions that I think future British historians will ask when they look back at this global anti-racist movement that fueled the events of 2020 is why, when that storm of protest made landfall in the United Kingdom, was so much of its energies spent not on contemporary and present-day racism and racial inequality in the campaign to end them, but on history, on the stories of slavery, empire, and migration. Historians found themselves on the front lines of these debates as the reputations of great men from past centuries were called into question. Statues fell, others were taken into protective custody. The targets of that remarkable moment were very often slave owners and slave traders from the 17th or the 18th centuries. Men like Thomas Pixton in Wales and Edward Colston in Bristol, the city I'm talking to you from this evening, but also men like Hans Sloane, the great collector whose collection became the nucleus of the British Museum, but who made a great deal of his wealth from his wife's plantations in Jamaica. Chapters of the British story that for a long time have been brushed under the carpet are now part of ongoing debate. Centuries of denial, selective amnesia, and in some cases, simple historical forgetting, are now clashing with a growing determination to look at our history, all of it, and call a halt to the process by which whitewashed and edited versions of our past, with the difficult chapters removed, is disseminated and taught in our schools. The history I was taught, and the history most of us were presented with at school, is a version of our past in which the 4 centuries of imperial power are relegated to the margins, and the most marginalized of all aspects of Britain's global story have, for a very long time, been the story of slavery. But since the 1960s, now 2 generations of historians have engaged in a process of disinterring the history of British slavery, and with it, the history of the Black presence in Britain. And that story of the Black presence often takes historians to Belfast, where 2 of the most important figures in the story against the battle against slavery, Frederick Douglass and Uludo Equiano, both spend a great deal of time. But it's only been in recent decades that we've come to understand that the history of slavery and the history of the slave trade and of the wider Black Atlantic economy was a truly national phenomenon, one that touched upon and changed every part of the United Kingdom. Because it wasn't long ago that it was presumed that the slave trade and the trade and the processing of slave-produced commodities, sugar and cotton above all, were histories that were imprinted only upon the stories of cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and London, and that they had little to do with the rest of the nation. One of the reasons this presumption seemed plausible was because we had, for lack of historical research, come to profoundly misunderstand the commercial complexity of the Atlantic economy and underestimate its scale. Tyneside, where I grew up, was typical in this respect. When I was a child at school in the Northeast, we assured ourselves that our region had clearly played no part in the Atlantic slave trade and that our merchants had never traded in human beings. After all, we reasoned, we were on the wrong side of the country. Our great rivers, the Tyne, the Tees, the Wear, discharged their waters into the North Sea, not the Atlantic. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, our economic miracle, we told ourselves, was built on steam and coal engineering and shipbuilding, not the trades in sugar or cotton or human beings. Yet, in the Northeast, as elsewhere, as almost everywhere, even as we told ourselves those comforting narratives, in the archives lay the documents, business letters, letter books, cash books, order books, that were to later utterly dismantle that breezy overconfidence. The northeast of England, despite geography, despite what we wanted to believe, was involved in the enslavement of Africans and involved in plantation slavery. Local historian John Charlton found 3,000 connections between buildings in the northeast on the wrong side of the country, far from Liverpool, far from Bristol, far from London. Still, 3,000 connections to the Atlantic slave-based economy. One Newcastle merchant, Ralph Carr, built and owned ships that carried food and fuel to the islands of the Caribbean, very like merchants from Belfast. Newcastle's coal from the seams of the Durham coalfield, burnt in the boilers of the plantation factories that heated the sugar juice crushed from the sugar cane to produce the rum, molasses, and unrefined sugar that was carried by Newcastle ships back to the United Kingdom and British ports in their triangular journeys. Another local family, seemingly uninvolved, seemingly distant from this ugly chapter in Britain's story, the Crowley family owned an ironworks. In their archives are orders for what are described as chains, shackles, and locks for Negroes' necks and branding irons. Ships from their ironworks sailed down the Tyne across the Atlantic to deliver those horrible objects to the plantations of the West Indies. The wealth of dynasties like the Carrs and the Crowleys derived from the murderous exploitation of people ripped from the continent on which I was born, helped build the city I grew up in. Our distance from Liverpool and London, from the cotton mills of Lancashire, were no insulation. The tentacles of the slave economy reached across the country. And yet, during my youth, none of this history was out in the open. Little of it was actually researched, never mind publicly acknowledged. Today, in 2021, we know much more and we know better. We are confronting the realities of Britain's role in the Atlantic economy, and at the heart of this transformation has been one of the most remarkable historical research projects of recent decades, the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project at the University College London. Deep within the archives at Kew Gardens near London are the T71 files, 1,631 leather-bound volumes, tied neatly together with bundles of letters, and they've lain on the shelves for 190 years, for the most part unexamined. Historians knew they were there, but the scale of the task of processing them was deemed to be beyond the resources, beyond the capacity of historical research for decades. They are the records and the correspondence of the Slave Compensation Commission. The Slave Abolition Act of 1833 formally freed 80,000 human beings who were the legal property of British slave owners. And that same act contained a provision for the financial compensation of the 47,000 owners of those human beings by the taxpayer for the loss of their property. The Compensation Commission was the government body established to evaluate the claims of the slave owners and administer the distribution of the £20 million the government had set aside to pay them off. That sum represented 40% of total government expenditure for the year 1834. Now, converting historic sums into their modern equivalents is a notorious inaccurate and complicated task, but by one calculation, that's the modern equivalent of around 16 or 17 billion pounds. And it was the largest bailout in British history right up until 2009, when the banks were bailed out. Yet what the legacies of British slave ownership project revealed is not just how much the slave owners were compensated, but who they were and where they lived. What the team revealed in its findings astonished people, because inevitably there were the great clusters of slave owners, slave traders, and those who grew rich on the sugar business in Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow, London, the cities associated with the trade and the sugar business. But slave ownership was shown to exist all over the country, in towns and cities with no obvious associations with the Atlantic economy, in villages in the English countryside, in small towns in the Highlands of Scotland, in the valleys of Wales, and yes, in the manufacturing towns of Ireland. Slave ownership was everywhere. Widely spread, as we know from other resources and other records, are other financial and commercial entanglements that enmeshed thousands of British families and companies into the Atlantic economy, particularly among manufacturers. The iron foundries of the Midlands, miles from the coast, produced the shackles and chains and the punishment collars and the branding irons that were dispatched to the plantations. Distilleries across the country produced the cheap hooch that was carried on the first leg of the slave traders' triangular journeys and bartered with for captured Africans on the coast. Firearms were produced across the country, simple guns that again were used to barter for human beings. The cotton merchants of Lancashire produced cottons that were dispatched to Africa for the same purpose, and the shoe manufacturers and the candle manufacturers of Ireland did the same. All of this taking place in vast quantities. These connections and interconnections are documented in millions and millions of records across the country. Yet for decades, most of us imagined, or at least wanted to imagine, that the slave owners and the slave traders were them, not us, that they operated from there, not here. One part of the United Kingdom has been slow, perhaps the slowest, to confront these realities, and that's been Scotland. Used to seeing itself as a victim of English imperialism rather than as part of an imperial power, Scotland has traditionally struggled to acknowledge its role in the Atlantic slave trade and West Indian slavery. And yet Scotland was not only involved, it was disproportionately involved. The Scottish historian Stephen Mullen has shown there was a disproportionate number of Scots among the owners who received compensation after abolition who were listed on the database of the Legacies of British Slave Ownership Project. On the island of Jamaica in the 18th century, around 1/3 of the plantation owners were Scots, and the Scots made up then about the same proportion in the British population as they do today, around 9–10%. Scotland was at the centre of both the Jamaican sugar trade and the North American tobacco trade, and the houses and the mansions of the tobacco lords and the sugar barons remain some of the jewels of the city of Glasgow's architecture. The evidence for Scotland's involvement in sugar slavery is hidden in plain sight. And it was that evidence that me as a child whose English family were descended from Scottish migrants to England, that made me see what had not been taught at school. As a child, we spent our holidays in Scotland. I loved holidays in Scotland because we got lots of sweets. The Scottish sweet tooth is renowned all over the world. My favourite sweets as a child, particularly on my trips to Scotland, were called Highland toffees, and they were produced by a company with a suitably Scottish name, McGowan's. It was only years later, in my late teens, when studying slavery at university, that I came to realise that the sugar in Highland toffee didn't come from sugarcane that was grown in the Scottish Highlands. And it was a legacy And Scotland's sweet tooth was a legacy of Scottish participation in the empire of sugar and slavery. And once I began to decipher the code of the hidden parts of our history, once I began to see the chapters that had been edited out of the version of the past I'd been taught at school, once I deciphered the code, I could see it everywhere. And I could see it in another part of my childhood, in music. My favorite band were the Wailers. Their music is perhaps the most important cultural export Jamaica has ever produced. Their leader, Bob Marley, is one of the most famous people to have ever lived, one of the most recognizable people in the world. His image is universally recognized across the first and the third world. Yet look at the names of the members of that original band. Robert Nesta Marley, whose father was a white Scottish Jamaican. Then there's Bunny Livingston, real name Neville O'Reilly Livingston. And then there's Peter Tosh, whose real name was Winston Hubert McIntosh. Marley, Livingston, McIntosh. It's hard to think of three more Scottish sounding names. And these are three Jamaican men living on an island in which 1/3 of the population have ancestors who less than 200 years ago were the legal property of Scottish slave owners in a system where the slave owners gave their enslaved property their family names. I mention the Northeast and I mention Scotland because it was through confronting the histories of those parts of our nation that I came to understand the missing history that I wasn't taught at school. And I mention them to make the obvious point that Ireland is very far from being alone in once having imagined or hoped that it was free from associations with the trade or the slave economy. Outside of Ireland today, little is known about its connections with the Atlantic economy of sugar and slavery. Perhaps the best known link in its part of its aspect of its history is the story of the indentured servants who were sent or who in desperate poverty agreed to have themselves sent to labour in the West Indies in the 17th century, and those forcibly transported there by Oliver Cromwell. The impact of the Atlantic economy and slavery on Ireland itself in terms of wealth accumulation from slave trading, the processing of slave-produced commodities, and the manufacturing of commodities then used and dispatched to the plantations, was for so long little discussed, as it was elsewhere in the United Kingdom. One of the few places where this history has been engaged with is where you are within Clifton House and among yourselves, the members of the Belfast Charitable Society, where historic links to benefactors who were part of the Atlantic economy has been made public and properly researched. The history of Belfast's involvement in slavery and the slave trade is one that many of you will know far more intimately than I. And many of the key names are ones that you will know intimately. Thomas Gregg, whose ships mastered the inter-island trade, providing supplies to islands upon which every acre of productive land had been given over to the planting of cash crops, made a fortune. Islands that could not feed themselves, not even provide the fuel to burn the boilers, because every inch of land was planted with sugar. There's Valentine Jones, who, among other things, provided alcohol, a key commodity to the plantation owners of Barbados and the other islands. Wherever you go in the ruins of Britain's empire of slavery, if you turn over the soil, you find evidence of the legacy, of the importance of men like Jones. I've picked up broken shards of wine bottles from the beaches surrounding slave forts on the coast of West Africa. I've fished 18th century and even 17th century gin bottles out of the Essequibo River in Guyana. And some of this great tsunami of alcohol that was poured into the slave economy was produced by traders in your city. Another Belfast merchant, Waddell Cunningham, an associate of Gregg and reputedly the richest man in Belfast, again a name you will know better than I. In some ways he stands as an archetype. He could just as easily be a figure in the history of Liverpool or Bristol or London or Glasgow. Like many of his ilk, he grew rich through a system built on enslavement, and like so many others, he worked hard to keep the reality of the slave trade hidden from his fellow countrymen and countrywomen, giving what we can only regard as false evidence to a parliamentary committee into the slave trade. These histories and these biographies are now out in the open. They're the subject of proper research. However, it's important that we do not limit our focus and our research to men like these who were directly involved in enslavement, who grew conspicuously wealthy. and that we don't allow ourselves to imagine that this is a history of them rather than us. The foundation that you've created is committed to exploring the wider role of Belfast and Ireland, its manufacturers, its sugar refiners, and shoe manufacturers and others in this history. And I commend you for that. But the very fact that these names are more familiar today than they have been at any time since their own lifetimes speaks to the fact that our relationship with history is changing. Yet that fact and that change is itself being contested. It is the subject of a backlash, and we are living through a moment in which the culture wars of the early 21st century are, in Britain and also in America, becoming history wars. Just this week, a government minister proposed a law to defend statues, irrespective of the lives lived or indeed the crimes committed by the men they portray, irrespective of local feeling, irrespective of any new revelations from the archives. This is being proposed in order to defend what is called our history, whatever that means. In the United States, again, just this week, the 1776 report was published, released symbolically and, you'd have to say, provocatively, on Martin Luther King Day. What it calls for is the promotion of what its authors describe as patriotic education, a myopic and distorted version of the American past that seeks to downplay the impact of American slavery and racism on the lives and the life chances of generations of African Americans, and its imprint on the historical character of that republic, and for that matter, on the British colonies from which that republic was formed. This is alternative history born from an age of alternative facts. Acknowledging the history of slavery and the slave trade, and acknowledging that between them, those trades birthed racism and white supremacy, we are being told in both the United States and the United Kingdom, is something that must be avoided, because to do so, we are assured, is divisive. Verifiable archival historical truths, they suggest, must be buried, because the work of historical scholarship and public history undermines the myths from which we might draw comfort and unity. Better, they say, to maintain the illusions and the myths, bury the documents, and leave the reputations of the men commemorated in marble and bronze uncontested and uncontextualized. This proposed new law and these confected arguments about divisions and divisiveness come in reaction to the fact that millions of people, particularly, but not exclusively, the young, are not only willing, they are determined to confront the once buried aspects of our history. In the process of resisting calls to the work of history to be halted, we have also to ask ourselves why this history was concealed for so long. Why is it now in the 21st century that we are the generations facing the task of uncovering and confronting and making public these histories? Part of the answer, I believe, lies back in the 1830s at the moment of abolition. In 1834, it was said by many that Britain was not just ending slavery, it was absolving itself of the sin of slavery, and that the £20 million paid to those 47,000 British slave owners was in effect blood money with which the nation would purchase absolution. Abolition was such a clear, obvious, manifest good that it was said it could somehow undo the terrible evils accumulated over 2 centuries of slave trading and slave owning. As well as washing away sin, abolition was a way of wiping away the past. The crimes of the 17th and 18th century would, after abolition, no longer merit, being properly remembered. Enslavement was to be replaced by free trade, and those who had grown rich on the backs of the enchained Africans were to keep their wealth and their compensation and invest it in legitimate trades. The role of the enslaved in all this was for them to be grateful. They were to demonstrate that gratitude through silence about the past, as well as through obedience in the future. They were to accept their place in the post-slavery world as cheap labor, living on the land of their former owners, land that great efforts were made to ensure they could not afford to purchase. They had been plucked from slavery and placed in a dire predicament, but the horrors of slavery were so great that gratitude was still regarded as the appropriate reaction. What was purchased, therefore, in 1834 was not just the bodies of 80,000 human beings, but a silence that lasted for 180 years. And this conspiracy of silence has been a feature of British life and British culture. That is what is coming to an end. The realities of slavery and the slave trade brushed to the margins with the realities of slavery and the slave trade brushed to the margins, the former sugar barons and tobacco lords could be remembered merely as members of the elite, and new money became old money as the sources of their wealth were forgotten. What was remembered, however, was their philanthropy, because it is true, undeniably true, that some of the men who traded in human flesh, who sold men, women, and children, who grew rich from the trade and the commodities produced by enslaved people, invested some of their wealth in philanthropy and charity. The great challenge facing us in the 21st century is to see how it was that men who did terrible things did and could sometimes use their money to do good. How do we make sense of all this? How do we think about schools, almshouses, charities, poorhouses, and the generations of people who benefited enormously from such institutions in the light of our growing knowledge about the men who funded them and the activities that made them rich? Escaping from the tacit compact that abolition justifies historical silence is not easy. It demands that we confront painful realities as well as these bewildering contradictions. As I said earlier, I'm talking to you from Bristol, where our confrontation with the fact that the city's most famous, though not most prolific, philanthropist was the slave trader Edward Colston, has torn the city apart. Around half of my fellow Bristolians are joyous that a statue to a man who was involved in the enslavement of, we estimate, 120,000 people and the deaths of around 20, that statue has been toppled and now lies covered in graffiti and scars from its journey to the harbour. Most people that I know are delighted by that turn of events. But half the city is outraged, and half the city believes that this is an attack on them and their culture. And they point to the philanthropy and the good that has been produced from Colston's money. We are bewildered by what has happened because the complexities, the moral contradictions of slave owner philanthropists is something that we have not confronted properly, because so much of this history is new. Its complexities and its bewildering contradictions are tearing us apart. If ever there was a case for historical truth and reconciliation, it is about this subject. And our relationship with the past, these debates, they're happening in real time. I want to talk about an event that took place hours ago. Last night, members of the US National Guard slept on the marble floors of Emancipation Hall in the US Capitol building in preparation for the inauguration ceremony that we've all just witnessed just 3 hours ago. The irony is obvious. Members of the National Guard stationed in the building that Americans regard as their temple of liberty, asleep on the floors of a hall named after emancipation of the enslaved of America, and stationed there in order to protect America's political system and the peaceful transfer of power from the violence of white supremacists. All of this taking place 160 years and 5 generations after the end of American slavery. But 20 years ago, that same building was the focus of attention from historians, and that hall was not called Emancipation Hall. Historians 20 years ago uncovered evidence that suggested that the Capitol building, along with other governmental buildings in Washington, D.C., had in part been built by enslaved Africans. The physical, spiritual center of American democracy, the heart of a nation dedicated to the principle of freedom, it was said, had been constructed by human beings who had been stripped of any freedom and reduced to the status of chattel. This horrific contradiction was so alarming that Congress set up what it called the Slave Labor Task Force. Its role was to delve into the archives and determine if these historians of slavery were correct. In 2005, the task force released its report. The historians were right. The so-called Temple of Liberty had indeed partly been built by enslaved human beings, skilled artisans rented from local slave owners in Washington, D.C. And the same was true, the report explained, of other historic buildings in other parts of the American Eastern Seaboard that all carried the imprimatur of slavery. How was Congress to respond to this news that confirmed the central contradiction of the United States, a republic dedicated and founded on the principle of equality by men who were themselves slave owners, that contradiction was literally built into the fabric of the Capitol building? The report acknowledged, to quote, enslaved blacks helped build the Capitol. They were hired out, not hired. They were leased or contracted by their owners to do work, essentially a contract between the Congress of the United States and the slave owners, with all funds going directly into the pockets of the slave owners. Congress acknowledged that the history of the slave contribution has been suppressed even in official histories of the Capitol in recent years. Not only was this true, people had known it was true and suppressed the evidence. The response of Congress to this encounter with a long suppressed history was to rename one of the Capitol's great halls Emancipation Hall, in honor, it was said, of the enslaved people who helped construct that building. This despite the fact that their involuntary labors took place 40 years before emancipation in the 1860s. That decision by Congress to name the hall in which the guardsmen slept last night was at the same time an acknowledgement and a denial. And it was emblematic of a tendency we've seen in operation here in the United Kingdom, as well as in the United States, for decades. The strong urge to focus on emancipation rather than slavery, upon abolitionists rather than the defenders of slavery. That tendency explains why we in this country know the name of the abolitionists, William Wilberforce and Tom Clarkson, but few of us can name the men who led the West India Lobby, the most powerful, influential political lobbying group in our history, the men who defended the slave trade and the right of British subjects to hold what they called property in men. Their names are unknown to the vast majority of us. They are obscured behind a cult of veneration built around Wilberforce. Abolition and abolitionists have long eclipsed slavery, and in doing so, helped create a false binary of good and bad, sin and absolution. The bias towards the end of slavery rather than its beginnings, towards positive rather than negative, the comforting over the harrowing, the symbolic over the substantive, has led to a broader distortion of our understanding of both slavery and abolition. And one of the challenges facing us in 2021 is how do we liberate the historical lives and reputations of the abolitionists from the function to which they've been put for so many decades, to be used as a distraction, to prevent a deeper engagement with the reality of slavery and the slave trade. For too long, there was a willingness to remember abolitionists while forgetting who and what they fought against. How do we celebrate them and their stories in new ways and not allow them anymore to be deployed as a distraction? We're here today in part to remember the life of one of those abolitionists, your own Mary Ann McCracken. And it's been asked recently, why is she not a household name? Why a woman well known in her lifetime, so remarkable, so engaged on so many issues, on so many fronts, could have been so forgotten? Part of the answer is certainly gender. Mary Ann sits alongside thousands of notable, remarkable, dynamic women forgotten to history or known only through their interactions with men. She is also inevitably a victim of the ways in which Irish history, in certain forms and certain tellings of British history, is often relegated to a separate, marginal, annexed subject. Another reason for her undeserved obscurity is that for a long time there was a conviction in the minds of many that Britain's relationship with enslavement ended in 1834 with the emancipation of the 80,000 enslaved people within the British Empire and their final manumission 4 years later. The great anti-slavery campaigns that operated beyond 1834 have been particularly prone to historical disappearance, despite the scale of those campaigns, despite how vocal and respected and well known their leading figures were. Yet another reason for Mary Ann's lack of profile is that abolition in Britain has for too long been dominated by the reputation of William Wilberforce. Although I admire Wilberforce, there is a cult around him that has acted as an historical black hole into which have collapsed the narratives of other figures. If such a fate could befall Thomas Clarkson, the most critical and engaged figure alongside Wilberforce in the struggle against the slave trade, and a man involved in the struggle against slavery and in anti-slavery into the 1840s, up to his death, it's unsurprising that it should have led to the diminution of historical reputations of other figures like Mary, far from the centre of power in London, and women. Mary Ann McCracken stands alongside other women abolitionists whose lives and life stories are only now in the 21st century being properly recovered. Here in Bristol, the reputation of Hannah More is being revived. Her image now wonderfully appears on our local currency, the Bristol pound. In the city of Leicester, the life of Elizabeth Hayrick is now better known than at any time since her death. A Quaker school teacher, she was the author of the pamphlet Immediate, Not Gradual Abolition, in which he demanded that West Indian slavery be, quote, crushed at once or not at all, to the shock of many older male abolitionists. We do a disservice to the enslaved if we remember abolition, not slavery. We do a disservice to the abolitionists if we fail to understand the complexities of their struggle and the scale of the opposition they faced. If we forget that they were not lauded and celebrated at the time, but often ridiculed as fanatics, particularly female abolitionists like Mary. Difficult though it is, we must resist the urge to see their struggles through 21st century eyes. We have to expect and accept contradictions and complexities, every bit as bewildering as that of the idea of the slave trader philanthropist. However, what also needs to be recognised is the extent to which political campaigners like Mary Ann were willing to do something that most people now find difficult even to envisage, and that is to dedicate their lives almost wholly to moral campaigns. Not their online lives, likes and follows, but their actual lives, through meetings and petition and leafleting and the ceaseless, endless, tireless campaigning to draw the attention of an often disinterested public to the suffering of other people thousands of miles away. They were willing to give up and surrender other opportunities and avenues of life, to put aside opportunities for commerce and wealth accumulation, to dedicate their lives to what our Victorian ancestors like to call the moral mission, to take the route of most resistance, to surrender not just their lives, but sometimes their diets to moral principles, and ask others to do likewise. This level of personal commitment raises difficult questions for us in the 21st century. Each of us are aware that the minerals that are critical to the operating of the phones in our pockets or on our desks are scraped from the earth by the hands of impoverished Africans. Very many of them children, all of them working on conditions that no child should ever be forced to endure. Conditions that Mary Ann would recognise from her readings of American slavery. All of us in the 21st century are likewise aware that the clothes in the shops that we frequent are in some cases produced in sweatshops by poor people, most of them women, working in hours that are injurious to health, in buildings that in too many cases are unsafe, as we have seen in Bangladesh and elsewhere. Increasingly, we know that right now in China, the production of cotton in parts of that country is carried out by members of the Uyghur minority who are the victims of a modern form of enslavement. Cotton, the fundamental commodity behind American slavery that drove the British Industrial Revolution, that Mary Ann McCracken fought so hard against, now in the 21st century once again, is picked by the hands of people who are unfree, right now in our own times. We know all of this, and yet no grassroots moral campaign on anything like the scale of that of the abolitionists and the anti-slavery campaigners of the 18th and the 19th centuries has emerged? Where is our equivalent of the sugar boycott? Where are our mass meetings and our monster petitions? Why do our politicians not quake in fear at our moral indignation? Our inaction, our political and moral passivity, our lack of outrage, I think, would surprise and disappoint women like Mary Ann McCracken, those who stood and struggled alongside the enslaved in the 19th century. Reviving her name and rediscovering her story and those of others like her might, I hope, I contend, help us to rediscover the moral indignation that I fear we are going to need in our own strange and disturbing and bewildering times. Thank you very much.
David, I think if we were in Clifton House, the whole audience would stand and applaud. They would stamp their feet and bang the tables. That was a magnificent lecture. I've noted as I heard what you said, that the message that you purveyed there was one of great strength. It was powerful, it was piercing, it was disturbing, it was compelling, it was demanding. And I think what it demands is that we all open our eyes in this part of the world to the tragedy and injustice that has lain on our doorstep for a long time, and that in the past we've just stepped over. And perhaps as a result of this, we'll stop stepping over that tragedy and injustice. You mentioned one or two names that may be familiar, will be familiar here. One is Hans Sloane. I'm speaking from outside Belfast, and he came from just down the road from me in a village called Killilay. And there's a fine statue there. And as befitted the times, he's wearing a full-bottomed wig in his statue and the finest of gowns in that statue. You mentioned Equiano as well, and he is someone that the Belfast Charitable Society is familiar with because he visited Clifton House, attended one of its meetings there. Frederick Douglass, you mentioned as well, he came to Ireland. It's not known that he came to Clifton House, but he came to Belfast in his tour of Ireland, and of course he went to Scotland and England as well. You mentioned a number of names, all of whom were on the board of the Charitable Society. They were on one side. Of course, there were other names like Thomas McCabe, who has a blue plaque in the school beside Clifton House, because that was his home before they built the school. And he, with Mary Ann, took a different view about this at the time. There are a number of, I'm anxious to recognize that other people have made considerable contributions, and there's some questions I'm going to pose on their behalf. If the audience would forgive me, but I think we found from experience the best way of managing practically these sorts of exercises is that the questions are funneled through me. And David has some notice of something that troubles people. But first of all, from Raquel, David, how do you view the responses to the Black Lives Matter protests that we've seen in America and the recent responses to the Trump demonstrations?
Well, I think we've learned a lot because when two events are juxtaposed, we can see the contradictions more clearly than ever. I think no one has any doubt that if that had been a group of Black Lives Matter protesters approaching the Capitol building, things would have ended differently. And the presumption, the sense of entitlement that those protesters or rioters or insurrectionists demonstrated is breathtaking. I find the phrase white privilege a difficult phrase because I think it's often landed very badly, and it's very difficult when it is used without an understanding of class, another huge issue. But I think if there's ever a demonstration of how being white allows you to do certain things in America that Black people would not be allowed to do, like leave that demonstration alive, that's what took place on the 6th of January this year. A few hours after the 46th president, one of the very many Irish presidents in the United States history, has been inaugurated, it is a moment for hope. I'm not feeling very hopeful because I was at the previous MAGA march at the end of November after I interviewed President Obama. And I stood in Washington and watched and listened to the things those crowds said. And I'm extremely fearful for the United States. But I think our job today is to try to have some faith and some hope that a president who's built his career on bringing people together can do his magic in the most powerful office in the world. But I feel today is not the day for me to indulge in my pessimism about America.
Thank you, David. There's a question from Christine, who's one of our white badge holders, which means that she conducts some of the tours around Clifton House. And she says Belfast Charitable Society has always been open about its abolitionist and pro-slavery views held by the board members in the past. How should we best present this history and the language that is used around this subject?
Well, I have to say, without sort of flattering my hosts, I mean, looking at your website and the materials that you sent me, I talked to a lot of organizations, and the thing that worries me is reticence. There is without naming names, there is a very important architectural building in the southwest of Britain that was built by a very notable slave owner who did many other things in his life. And in their literature, slave owner is the last issue. It is the source of all of his wealth. It is fundamental to who he was. And it's that reticence that many organizations have that I don't feel in your approach at all. And it's understandable. This is difficult. And very often we want to trumpet the things that we can be proud of. And it's very, very difficult to confront histories that are painful as well as celebratory. But juxtaposing both to show that members and benefactors were on both sides and that the story is connected to both sides, I think this is the direction that we need to travel in. We need to think that history is not only there to make ourselves feel good. It's there to make us think. And in some ways, the bewildering complexities and contradictions of slavery and enslavement and our roles in it, I think is a perfect mental exercise in making us understand that history is not merely a collection of comforting stories. It's challenging, and it should be challenging.
Well, I think that, David, that is a lesson for those of us who live in Ireland and have to deal with its history, as well as the subject you're speaking about directly. I think that carries over, and thank you for the way you put that. Now, I've got a question from Greta, and it's this. From your research, what campaigns do you think Mary Ann would have championed today?
Well, as I said, I find it hard to believe that somebody who did what she did would not be appalled by the pictures that we're seeing coming out of China. And there is something, it's very difficult as an historian who's read documents and encountered material in the archive and been to places to do with American cotton slavery. And one of the things I spent a lot of time talking about is trying to make people in Britain, particularly in the Northwest, I teach at Manchester University, appreciate that the story of cotton in the Deep South is a British story as much as an American story. And we are very prone to washing our hands of American slavery, seeing it as something that's wrong with America, and forgetting that the cotton that left Mobile, Savannah, Georgia, and New Orleans landed in Liverpool. Some of it, of course, landed in Belfast, but most of it landed in Liverpool. We're very good at outsourcing parts of history that we are deeply involved in. And I think the horrible irony of the fact that in the beginning of the 21st century, we can see pictures of people who are enslaved, who are living in concentration camps, picking cotton with their hands, is something that you would hope that someone like Marianne would have gone to her grave presuming that it was coming to an end. It was that was over. She died. There was still slavery all over the world, particularly in Brazil at the time of her death. But the impetus, the writing was on the wall for slavery. You would have hoped, you would have presumed, to be horrified to think in the 21st century we'd be getting those pictures back from Guangdong province.
Thank you, David. There's 100 responses on the chat line, and if you can think of a superlative, it will be among them. Now, there are a variety of questions on a theme which is to do with the comparison with the colonization of Ireland. And I think what, in various ways, people are getting at looking at our history with the colonization of the island from Britain, with the treatment of the people here, some of whom were sent to the West Indies, and you touched on that earlier, and the parallels that there might or might not be with the treatment of enslavement from Africa. I'm not sure to what extent you've studied the history of Ireland, but are you able to say anything about those parallels or
yes,
lack
absolutely.
of them?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I've had the history of Ireland is another one of those histories that was not touched upon in my schooling. It was something that I had to learn subsequently at university and later. And I think it's extremely worrying that people from England aren't taught the history of Ireland as a fundamental part of their history lessons. But that aside, I think we need to be really, really careful here, because there's a risk that two appalling chapters in the history of Britain and the Empire are placed unnecessarily in competition with one another. The fate of indentured labourers, and particularly prisoners of war from Ireland, particularly at the hands of Cromwell in Barbados, was absolutely horrific. There is no question that they were crimes against humanity. There is no question that there was an ethnic, if not a racial dimension to that. But there is a difference between that and chattel slavery. Now, there are technical differences. The most important one is enslaved people were enslaved for life, and that their children, the child of an enslaved person, was enslaved. And it was a racialized system. It was also a codified system. One of the most shocking documents, I think, in all of British history is the Barbados Slave Code. And the Slave Code is written to draw a distinction between what can be done to white people who can be very poor, who can be indentured, but are still people, and what can be done to Africans who under this system are not people. And it legitimizes mutilation and murder. That document is a tipping point in British history, and it shows that a racialized system was a way of drawing a distinction between people who were acknowledged to be human, even though they were abused, even though they were lowly, and those who were not recognized as human. But I think more fundamentally, and more importantly to us today, it's not just the story of slavery, it's what slavery left behind, which is the idea of race. And that, as much as the legacy of slavery, the idea of race that metastasized over the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century, and is the reason why 40 million Americans live in conditions that are profoundly different, with different rights, different expectations of police, of education, of law enforcement from white Americans. It is because racialized slavery in the Caribbean and the Americas generated the ideas that we're still living with. And that's another thing that I think makes it distinct.
David, I'm going to call a halt to the proceedings now. There are questions I haven't asked, and I apologize for that, but we've trespassed on your time for the permitted period, and I thank you for what has been a truly magnificent lecture. This will be recorded and it will go into the archives of the Charitable Society. The Society has archives dating back to the 1700s, and access to them for research is made available to and accessed by the historians here at Queen's and the Ulster University. And I used the word treasure trove earlier, and they are a real treasure trove of material as to life in that period. But I mention that because I think your lecture will be in the archives for another 249 years when someone else will be talking about it. Thank you so much for such a stimulating talk and for your contribution to the launch of the Mary Ann McCracken Foundation.
Thank you so much for having me. And again, my terrible regrets that I couldn't be with you in Clifton House today.